The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, does Doug Ford want to be Premier of Ontario or Ontario's capital city? Then, former federal cabinet minister Lloyd Axworthy reflects on his life in politics and the Liberal government today. That's next on The Agenda. There was a time in Ontario when the provincial government focused on the really big issues: clean air and water, intercity rail service, provincial parks, good education policy, effective hospital care. Not anymore. Doug Ford's government is different. Exhibit A, deciding where the capital city can and cannot put bike lanes. What's going on here? Why is it starting to feel like Toronto versus Ontario? Let's ask former Toronto mayor and longtime community activist John Sewell, crisis communications consultant Amanda Galbraith, co-founder and partner of the Oyster Group, and in Burlington, Ontario, Globe and Mail politics reporter Laura Stone. And it's great to have you two here in our studio. Laura, thanks for joining us on the line from beautiful Burlington and Halton region. Let me just I put together this little fact file here that will just sort of get us to where we want to get to on this whole Toronto versus Ontario thing. Let's go back to July 2023, when Doug Ford said that if Olivia Chow became the mayor of Toronto, it would be an unmitigated disaster. And then a few days later, after she won, he said, she's actually a very nice person. And then in November 2023, Ontario uploaded responsibility for the Gardiner Expressway and the Don Valley Parkway to the province, saving the capital city $1.9 billion over 10 years. So the relationship is looking pretty good. Then in October of 2024, Bill 212 prohibits bike lanes from being built if a lane of traffic is removed as a result. It would also allow the province to remove existing bike lanes, and this has begat a whole firestorm of controversy. John Sewell, the relationship between the city and the province has clearly become more problematic. What's going on?
Well, I mean, we've had this problem for a long, long time. I just think Mike Harris, he did a whole bunch of things to the city that never should have happened. He amalgamated the city against the wishes of 76% of the people who voted in the referendum. He downloaded a whole bunch of stuff. So it's the same stuff. And I mean, that's not all. Bill Davis even, and we all honor Bill Davis, but Bill Davis signed a thing called the Edmonton Agreement, I think in 1975, which said that the province would never reduce funds to to cities unless the cities agreed to it. And then, sure enough, later, a year or two later, he reduced those funds. So we're constantly in a fight. And the reason is that under the Constitution, Canada is a creature of Toronto is a creature of the provincial government. And so they can do what they want, and they do. And the city for a long time has been saying, we need powers that can't be interfered with by the provincial government.
More on that to come. All right, Amanda, what do you see?
I see that it is politically advantageous, candidly, for the province and the city to be fighting at different times. When Mayor Chow was first elected, it was politically advantageous for the Premier and her to get along, right? She got, I think, a huge win out of the upload. And now
the two highways.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And now that Premier Ford is looking into a potential election, now the rumors are that may actually not happen. I think they've seen the polling numbers, and they see that it's politically beneficial to pick this fight. Now, why is it politically beneficial to pick this fight? Because the people of the city are frustrated by gridlock. Just yesterday, I believe, the team in town to play, the NHL hockey team in town to play the Leafs, had to get out of their bus and walk through downtown Toronto because it's insane in a major city that we cannot function properly.
This was the Utah hockey team, right?
Yeah, who I've never heard of, by the way. I don't follow hockey.
They're brand new.
There's a Utah hockey team, but they documented it all. Like it's funny, but it's actually it's criminal that we can't actually move people enough around in this city. So I think they're tapping into a frustration. I think it is real. And I think the idea that currently the city's governed by sometimes people downtown who think I live in Etobicoke now, that everybody rides bikes and doesn't have to drive cars. Like I used to ride my bike all the time. I have to drive a car now. And they see proliferation of bike lanes at the expense of their own ability to get around when we haven't kept up with building transit. So I think it's a fight that they want to have.
Laura, you've been following the relationship between City Hall and the provincial legislature for some time now. They were getting along so well, and now they're not. How come?
Look, I think it's surprising that they have been getting along so well. I think, as we led into the segment, Steve, you kind of replayed Doug Ford's words from the past saying how much of a disaster Olivia Chow would be. He said this during the campaign, and he backed one of her main rivals, the former Toronto police chief. So kind of heading into it, everyone thought, well, Doug Ford and Olivia Chow are going to hate each other. They're never going to work. And then they sort of teamed up on this New Deal for Toronto. They both criticized the federal government for shelter spaces for refugees, and they were getting along. Look, I don't really see this as a personal fight between Doug Ford and Olivia Chow. I see this as Doug Ford being very heavily invested in the city of Toronto, obviously, as we've seen from pretty much day one when he slashed Toronto City Council in half and various other moves that he's made. He really cares about the city of Toronto. And he drives to Queen's Park. He sees the bike lanes in his area on Bloor Street. I think he's got, quite frankly, a bee in his bonnet on this particular issue. And he also sees the polling on it. And according to the Progressive Conservative polling arm, he views this as a popular measure, even from within the city. So I think, Amanda's right in that this is a political moment for him. There could be an election. He wants to kind of take on the issues that he views as popular, and he is a populist politician. But I think it's also deeply personal for him as an issue that he sees with his own eyes every day.
Well, let me pick up on that with John Sewell. He represents a riding in the 416. We actually have had very few premiers in Ontario history who represent a riding in Toronto.
Right.
So is there anything wrong with him taking, as a Toronto MPP, a particular interest in Toronto issues?
He can take an interest in it, but for him to override City Council on something it has clear legitimacy to do seems to me to be wrong. We have legislation that sort of outlines what the city can do and what it can't do, and he's willing to override that all the time. I mean, he's doing it with the supervised consumption sites as well. Mm-hmm. He's overriding legislation that clearly allows the city to do that. And it seems to me that government should try and stick out of the other people's turf.
Now, you go back a little bit, so I'm going to ask you to sort of look in the recesses of your memory here. Bob Rae was a premier who represented a Toronto riding. So was Kathleen Wynne. Yep. Did they get involved in the granular aspects of everyday life in the way that Doug Ford is? No. You're sure about that? I'm sure. I'm pretty sure about that. And the same is true of Bill Davis. I gave that example about the Edmonton commitment, but that was a province-wide thing. It wasn't just about the city of Toronto. Amanda, what about this notion that he's the premier? He should be looking out for provincial issues that have relevance province-wide, and he shouldn't be sticking his nose in where bike lanes do or are not supposed to go.
I mean, I understand people making that argument, but to your point, he is a Toronto MPP. People forget, but the Conservatives have, like the provincial or Progressive Conservatives have a huge amount of seats in, like they have Toronto seats, like not an insubstantive amount. So issues. We should say as well, for elections from I think 2003 until 2018, I don't think the Conservatives won a single seat in Toronto. No, that's true. No. Except one by-election, but not a general election seat in the whole city. Exactly. And so the fact that he's got a lot here now says something. And it says that people like his idea of how the city should be run. So we can argue, yes, should the premier be arguing about where bike lanes sit on certain roads? Like maybe he's got other things to do, but obviously he wants to represent, I think, the city of Toronto. They want to keep those seats, just like we saw with the 413, that argument, we don't need more highways. It's wildly popular. They want all the seats there. It's wildly popular in the city for a reason. And to my mind, do I like the idea of the province meddling to this level in the city? No, I do not. But do I think this happens when politicians see levels of government not being responsive enough to the needs of the citizens and ignoring them? I do. And I think you're going to see the premier take an opportunity. That's where he's politically savvy. John Sewell's shaking his head. What's going on? Well, I mean, part of the problem is that the data doesn't support the idea that bike lanes are the problem with congestion. I mean, given the fact I have trouble with my knees, I've got to drive, and taxis are my own car. Construction is the big problem everywhere. It's not bike lanes. I think they figured out bike lanes is 4% of the problem. My wife recently had to go out to Sherway Gardens, and so she went on Google to find the best route to go. The best route to go, according to Google, along Bloor Street, the whole way. Driving in a car. That's a long way. That's right.
Bike lanes are not the problem. I agree that he seems to think that politically they're important, but in fact they're probably from people who in fact don't have any experience with how they actually work and so forth. Well, they're willing to blame the bike lanes on something that they shouldn't be blaming them on.
Let me get Laura to follow up on that, because in your first answer, Laura, you said that there was polling that suggested that the Premier's getting involved in what I think most people think is a pretty local issue as opposed to a provincial issue was polling very well. What's that a reference to?
From what I understand, kind of speaking with progressive conservative pollsters, those who work on the issue, it's quantified as kind of a 2-to-1. That two people support the idea of every one that doesn't. So they view it as a popular exercise. Amanda mentioned the idea of gridlock. I mean, we could talk about whether the Premier should be getting involved in the nitty-gritty of what the city should be doing. But I think the issue of congestion, of traffic, of gridlock, of getting around the city, that is probably the number one issue for most voters. And transit as well. And the provincial government has put a substantial amount of money into that, as has the federal government. So I think it's kind of, I think there are smaller kind of details that the Premier is involved in, but they're part of a bigger piece of the puzzle, I think, that the Ford government has been preoccupied with for quite some time now.
Well, let me see if I can spitball this here, and we'll get you two to comment on it. If you've got the so-called downtown or inner city types mad at you, but you've made a decision, like bike lanes, where you get the inner suburbs, the 905, and the exurbs on your side, that's pretty smart politics, isn't it, John Sewell?
It's smart politics, but it's not good politics. I mean, it's good for getting election, but elected, what we want good politicians to do is to represent larger issues and try and address those larger issues and not get caught up in the small stuff. And this is being caught up in the small stuff.
Smart versus good politics. What do you see?
I think candidly it's both, because candidly it's not about bike lanes. It's about how people get around the city. It's about the fact that I have to take from Etobicoke, which should be a 20-minute drive downtown. It takes me over an hour each way. It is wild that, like, even when I lived in Leslieville trying to get downtown in the city again, it went from 20 minutes to 45, and that was using transit. So I will say getting around this city, getting around this region is a huge crisis. I think the Premier has every right and should be directly involved. And that means saying, get those bike lanes out of there so people can get home faster. Like, that's what he should be doing. I have no issue with that.
But the thing is, you're going to get rid of the bike lanes. And let's see the construction on that and what that does to drivers for in that period. And it's not going to get you home any faster. I mean, that's the point. Getting rid of the bike lanes isn't going to solve a congestion problem. Simply not going to do it.
Laura, this is, we like to think this is one of those programs where empirically provable facts actually matter and where we care about them. and I think we've all seen the studies that say the effort to rip out the bike lanes is A, going to be expensive, and B, going to cause even more traffic jams. And there was, I think, a Toronto City Councillor named Mike Cole, former member of the legislature, who said we should put up signs all over the city saying, if you're stuck in traffic, blame the Premier. It's his ripping out the bike lanes that is causing this problem. Having said that, talk to us, if you would, about the politics of this. If you've set up a coalition where inner city people are on their own and inner suburbs, 905, and exurbs are on your side, how does that look if you're a progressive conservative?
I think it is sort of the new culture war that we're seeing, right? This war on bike lanes. It's headline grabbing. It's very divisive, and people are talking about it. And I think it would be a bit of a fallacy to think that even those living in downtown Toronto support the bike lanes. I think there's lots of people who even live in the city who don't want them, but there is obviously a very vocal group of people who use bike lanes, who want them, who support them, and who don't want the Premier and the provincial government to spend time ripping them out. What kind of the split on that is, how many people support, how many don't. I don't know that we have the key facts of exactly what that looks like. But I think this too is kind of a Doug Ford nod to conservative voters, to progressive conservative voters. I think he's done a lot since returning from the lengthy break of the summer to tip his hat to some of the more conservative members of the electorate who maybe have become a bit more fed up with his government, who viewed him as maybe being too centrist or too leading to the left. And I know some people will watch this and laugh that anyone perceives him like that. But I think there actually were a lot of disaffected conservatives post-COVID at Doug Ford. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people are looking at what he's doing now, like, let's tunnel under the 401, let's get rid of bike lanes. He's throwing some red meat, I think, more at conservatives who maybe were a bit disenchanted with him over the past couple of years.
I mean, I thought it was interesting that one of the amendments he brought in to the legislation getting rid of bike lanes is the one that says his government can't be sued by anybody who was injured or killed because a bike lane has been taken out.
What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me he doesn't care about people riding bikes. In fact, the point is bike lanes make things much safer for bike riders and also, I think, for car drivers because they're separated out. And he just throwing them, literally throwing them under the bus.
I think that is a bit too much to say the Premier's throwing people under the bus and people have died. And honestly, I don't think also the Premier doesn't care about people who ride bikes. Governments indemnify themselves all the time in legislation. They did so around the Greenbelt. It's not new. It's not unusual. It's actually smart policy.
Well, I think it is unusual. It's very rare for politicians to pass legislation saying, you can't ever sue us because we passed this law. Doug Ford, I think, is the first premier that I'm aware of in Ontario who's ever done that.
I want Amanda to have a chance to react to something that the leader of the opposition said the other day, I think it was just last week, about why the premier seems to be getting involved in issues of such a granular nature. Let's put it that way. Sheldon, the clip, if you would.
There's two things going on here. One is Doug Ford is fighting the battles that he lost when he was a city councillor here in the city of Toronto, right? Can't get over that. And the second thing is he is trying to distract from his schemes and his scandals and the damage that his government is doing to the province of Ontario. And so I absolutely think that's what this game was all about.
Politics of distraction? What do you think?
I don't think so because you could argue that it is an effective distraction, but I actually think the fights they're picking are the fights they want to have, like to Laura's point. If the city of Toronto set up signs in front of every place he ripped out a bike lane and said, this is because Doug Ford is ripping out bike lanes, I'm pretty sure the Premier's office would throw a party. Would be so happy for that. I remember when we were on Mayor Tory's campaign back then and we were talking about Smart Track, which now is not Smart Track, and people kept arguing with us about how it could not be built. And every time they argued it could not be built, we were thrilled because people were talking about how we were trying to build something. So Merritt Stiles, I think, certainly has an avenue. This is distracting from maybe meatier issues that she would like to talk about, like perhaps healthcare or that people don't have family doctors, certainly. But to say that this isn't something that I think people are seized with or frustrated with in the city, how they get around, how people get around in the greater region, I think that is, to Laura's point earlier, I think that's the number one issue that people care about.
Well, this is where, again, we try to deal with empirically provable facts here.
Sure.
And here's Brian Rossborough, who's Executive Director of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, AMO, who says, our concern is about the province substituting its authority for municipal authority because we don't have a lot of examples of where that has been successful. John Sewell, in your experience, who knows best for Toronto, the city or the province?
Toronto does. The people who get elected in Toronto, they're the ones who have the best. And if they're wrong about it, they won't get elected next time. I mean, it's real simple. This is what elections are about. So, I think we should say, you got to remember that Olivia Chow has only been in office for a year. It's not as though she was elected way, way, way back when and people have lost sight of what she stands for. So, it's pretty straightforward. Toronto politicians are the ones who should be making decisions about Toronto. And of course, as my argument is, they should have a lot more power to do a lot more things so that we could do things. I mean, we're getting the Ontario line. Well, it's not where Toronto wanted to build it. We had our own, the province gets to decide that. There's interference all over the place, and it's a big problem.
Well, to that end, about the capital city having more of its own say, let's, Laura, I'll bring you in on this because back in 2007, Dalton McGuinty was the Premier of Ontario. He passed something called the City of Toronto Act, which gave the city more powers to do its own thing. Previous city councils have availed themselves of that act to do some things that they otherwise couldn't do. But the city, at least certainly a lot of people I talk to, want the power to do more. They want Toronto to have a lot more of its own authority over its own affairs. What might that look like? What do you hear?
I mean, I think there's kind of a constitutional question here, right? I think, it's been characterized or outlined that the cities are the products, I suppose, of the provinces. I think, it is a bit of a battle that's happening at the different government levels. I think Doug Ford really does kind of look back, maybe, I don't know if it's using the term fondly is correct, but he does talk a lot about the past, about his time as a councillor and about his time when Rob Ford was mayor. And so I think he is, to Mart Stiles' point, kind of fighting that past fight that he maybe wasn't successfully able to win. I think, if you're a city councillor, of course you would want more say over your own affairs. You would want to be able to fight back against the province that is trying to remove lanes that you as a councillor put in because you thought that was the best use for the neighborhood. So, whether the council kind of avails itself of that, I'm not as familiar with kind of the ins and outs of what a city council can and can't do. But I think there is kind of the greater battle between what the province has the right to do and what we've seen Doug Ford avail himself of versus, what the city is willing to push back on.
Amanda, do you think the city should have more powers to do what it wants to do?
Yeah, I do think they should have more powers. I mean, they should have more taxation powers. I think they should have more authority for sure. At the end of the day, they are creatures of the province, as we know, and the province can come in and drop the hammer, as Kathleen Wynne did when the City of Toronto passed road tolls on the Gardner and DVP. And then she came in and said, nope, that's not electorally beneficial for me. I'll double the gas tax funding, right? So, but yeah, I think the services that cities provide today are far outsized and have creeped in scope to the degree to which we can't fund them on a property tax base. And you also see this huge growth in development charges, which is hampering our ability to build housing. So yeah, I think the system itself is broken. But I also think more senior levels of government exist to provide a check on lower levels of government. And people are inherently frustrated with the decay they're seeing in the city, with encampments, with traffic congestion. And if that is not being solved at the municipal level, and right now it is not, then yes, they elect people from the City of Toronto, but they also elect MPs and MPPs. So those other elected officials can step in and have and done to fix it.
John Sewell, you have talked in the past about creating Toronto as a charter city.
Yeah.
What does that mean and what would it do?
Well, a charter city would mean that it has powers that the provincial government couldn't interfere with. And the way to get it is really, really simple. Under the Constitution, there's a thing called the Single Province Amendment. And if the provincial government went to the federal government and said, we'd like to give more powers to cities, and here are the powers you'd like to give them, including, as you say, taxation powers, the federal government can approve that by a simple vote of the House of Commons and the Senate. And we get more powers. The Single Province Amendment has been used a number of times in Canada. It was used by Newfoundland and Labrador to get rid of separate schools. Mm-hmm. It's been used by Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick to build that bridge across the strait there. It's been used by the Quebec government a number of times. So it'd be easy for the provincial government to do that. And giving the city more powers would really help. If we got more money, we wouldn't have to go to the feds and the province for funds for housing or transit. We could actually say, hey, that's our responsibility, we're going to do it. I might say that if you go to Scandinavia, they have a different system. Like in Canada, we have the feds, the province, and municipal governments. Over there in Scandinavia, they have the feds, the state, and municipal governments. They aren't on top of one another. They each have their own powers. Very few shared cost programs. It works a lot better because it means you actually have responsibilities. You don't deliver. People say, we'll get a government that does.
One quick follow-up, though. Most governments I have encountered over the years don't like to give up authority.
You got it.
And you're asking a provincial government to give up authority that it currently has over municipalities. So why would they do that?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, here it is. Toronto's the biggest city in Canada. Why would the province want to give up any powers over that? Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. And we need some politicians who are going to stand up for larger issues and say, come on now, we're going to give up powers because it's going to improve government. And it means that the Ontario government can concentrate on other areas. which it should be doing.
You know, if you look at the politics of this, Amanda, in some respects, that scenario that John Sewell just laid out makes some sense, because if things are going badly in the city, people would blame the city. Right now, people tend to blame the province for everything. They'd have some political cover if they allowed Toronto to have additional powers. Or am I just smoking something here?
I don't know what you smoke, Steve. But I do think, listen, I actually think people are blaming the feds, interestingly, a bit more than they're even blaming the province right now. Just I think people are frustrated and aiming their guns there. But if you want to actually look at facts here, the premiers, this government they gave strong mayor powers to major cities, which previous progressive governments did not. That's actually, as someone who worked in City Hall, to get something done, you have to go to council, get everyone to vote, do a report, they report back, then you debate it again, and then it's a very convoluted process. Strong mayor powers are hugely transformative as far as what the mayor can and cannot do. And that's a huge stick to wield. And of course, progressives are like, oh no, we can never possibly use it. And then the mayors get elected, and then of course, guess what? They're using strong mayor powers.
Some of them do.
Some of them do.
don't.
Not all of them, but
Yeah.
I bet you in 10 years from now, they're all using the strong mayor powers, right? So I think that has happened. Do I think any provincial government who's got any political sense, no matter what side of the political spectrum they're on, are going to give more autonomy to the City of Toronto to tax and do what they want? Probably not.
I'm down to my last 30 seconds here, because time flies when you're having fun. And Laura, I heard Amanda say earlier that the hot rumor is that there is not going to be a spring election next year. Did I hear you say that right?
I heard there's rumors that people are not everyone is convinced.
Okay. Laura, you got any sort of up-to-date intelligence on the status of that?
I don't. The way things are going and sort of how we're seeing the province pre-position themselves, all signs point to me that there would be an early election, particularly to kind of preempt what happens on the federal scene. I had heard potentially that maybe the Liberals think they will make it to next fall, and maybe that gives the province a little more wiggle room. But I would think that the calculations for Doug Ford to call an early election are still there to kind of throw his opponents off, particularly Bonnie Crombie, who is the Liberal leader and lesser known in the province, and to hold off on a federal Conservative win, because that is going to be maybe a bit more difficult for Doug Ford to get reelected if Pierre Poilievre wins an election just before he is taking voters to the polls in Ontario.
John Sewell smiling because in municipal life, they actually do have fixed election dates and they mean something. So there you go. Can I thank everybody for joining us on the program today? Amanda Galbraith, John Sewell, Laura Stone. Great to have you all in or around TVO anyway. Thanks so much. Back in the day, the bird that was the Liberal Party of Canada had two wings, a social justice wing and a business wing. They coexisted pretty well and kept the Liberals balanced and in power for the lion's share of the last 100 years. One prominent Liberal has never been under any illusion as to which wing he preferred. As you'll hear from Lloyd Axworthy, who spent more than 2 decades in public life working with 3 different prime ministers. His new book is called My Life in Politics. And we're delighted that it has brought the former MP from Winnipeg to our studios. Great to have you in that chair.
Thanks, Steve. Good to be here.
Your political awareness, I guess, begins when you're a young kid and you go to hear a speech given by a Nobel Prize-winning politician.
Right.
Who was that and what did he talk about?
Well, one guess, but just to give you, again, the preface, I can remember we had a history professor named J.J. Phillips. Tough guy, but really a good teacher. And he announced to our history class that we were going to listen to a politician. And you can imagine grade 11s, 17-year-olds moaning and groaning until he told us that 20% of our marks were at stake. And if we didn't show, we would, nothing like a little sort of educational intimidation to bring out the best of you. And I went and I know this sounds something out of an urban legend or something, but Mike Pearson was down there with his polka dot bow tie, and not exactly what you call a Hollywood casting character, but he talked about what it meant to be a Canadian. It talked about how over time we had sort of developed diversity with some respect, that we had a parliamentary system that gave people a chance to participate. We had an economic system that was a mix of government and private sector. But the important thing he said is that we have a foundation that's distinctive. Not better or worse, but distinctive. And we have to use that. and he wanted to talk about his Nobel Prize, and that's when he said that the great sort of vocation of Canada is to help build a world in which there is stability and security, and we do that by collaboration and cooperation.
Did you
walked out of there.
Did you walk out of there as a big L liberal as a result of that?
I know it was a big L liberal. I walked out thinking, politics? Interesting. Being a Canadian, yeah. And, the serendipity of history is that 30 years later I end up having his job.
There you go, foreign minister. Yeah. We'll come to that. Your actual connection to Ottawa and federal politics in this country comes after a guy named John Turner invites you to go to Ottawa and work for him. What was that all about?
Well, I guess when I showed up at a Liberal convention, those were the days, you'll remember this, you're old enough to remember, when we actually had big conventions and great debates on the floor. And I remember there was a big debate in the Chateau Laurier, and sort of smart-ass graduate students like me and others, we were all Walter Gordon fans, foreign ownership and healthcare, and we took on sort of the mandarins and the senior guys. And about 2 weeks later, I get a call from Jerry Grafstein, who worked with John, and Jerry says, "Would you like to come and walk with John Turner? He's becoming the Consumer Corporate Affairs Minister, and he wants you to do his policy for him." And that.
That's in Mike Pearson's government.
Yeah, that's right. In the last throes of it, and again, he was an individual who really certainly shaped my political ethos. I mean, he was such a parliamentary. He had a view that a member of Parliament is not somebody who loses sort of 100 yards from the Parliament Hill. That's a calling. It's a vocation. It's something that you take as a real sacred trust that people have elected you to do it. And plus, he was gutsy. And you've written a book about him, so you know. But when he brought in the whole change on the generic drug law to enable us to actually provide an alternative to the fairly extensive patent protection, his constituency had the big pharmas in it. He had a lot of people from the business community, but my job with him is to go out and talk to the other side of the equation, and I learned from that is that you always have to have, a sort of outreach, a connection, and. Plus, John had the best Rolodex in the world, and
that he did.
You know it, Steve, but until I had such a fondness because I know every day when my birthday came up, I knew there would be a call about 9 o'clock in the morning. Hey, it's John. How you doing? Hanging in there? Yeah, wonderful man.
You eventually decide to go back to Winnipeg. You get yourself elected to the Manitoba legislature. You ultimately decide to seek a federal seat in 1979. That's not a good election for you Liberals. No. That's Joe Clark beating Pierre Trudeau. You're one of only 2 Liberals elected west of Ontario, and you barely win. Did you figure, I'm here for a good time, but probably not a long time?
No. I really felt that there was that we had roots. The gurus in Toronto who were running the campaign, I think Keith Davey called me to say, I hate to tell you, Lloyd, but you're 188th out of 240 possible elections. And I said, Keith, you're basically full of you-know-what. Because I had my own pollster, a guy named Angus Reid, who was a sociologist, and he set himself up a little office of a sort of a 7-Eleven, and that started his career as a pollster. And he said, the guys in Ontario are reading the wrong kind of metrics. He said, it's going to be close. You're not running away, but you're in the game.
And he was right.
And he was right.
1980 is your second election. And again, you're one of only 2 Liberal MPs from Western Canada. This time, though, Pierre Trudeau comes back. He wins a majority government. You're in cabinet as the Minister of Employment and Immigration. Your brother Tom is a top advisor to the Prime Minister as well. What was the most exciting thing about being in cabinet in the early 1980s with Pierre Trudeau as Prime Minister?
Well, I'm going to provide a slight alteration. The most exciting thing is to meet the woman who became my wife for the next 40 years. And Denise, I would never have met her if I hadn't sort of, in 79, got elected.
You met her through politics.
I met her through politics, and it's been, well, ever since, one of those great moments. But going into cabinet, there's two things I'd like to share with you. One is that without knowing going in, but I became part of a government that passed the Charter on Freedom of Rights, which to me is one of the most defining moments in the history of this country. It identified who we were in a very kind of direct way, and have been part of that process and all the debates that went on over 2 years. And the second part was that I was given two portfolios, employment immigration, which had a lot to do with human rights, and also the sort of status of women, which also, I mean, that was a powerful lobby in the creation of that charter. So talk about kind of getting sort of from the fairly calm fields of provincial politics. I was right in the midst of the cyclone, but boy, it was a great moment, and it's one I still cherish.
Didn't last. 4 years later, Brian Mulroney comes in, wipes you guys out. Only a handful of Liberal opposition members survive. You're one of them. They create something called the Rat Pack.
Yeah.
There's a small handful of them who are taking politics to a whole new level of, I don't know what you want to call it, but it's very in your face, it's very obnoxious, it's very tough stuff.
Very, very robust.
Robust is another word for it, but you didn't join it. You didn't like it, eh?
It wasn't. I liked it. I had a couple of other ambitions. One, after 4 years, I thought I needed to refresh myself, and I wanted to think a little bit more. I mean, clearly, we lost not just because we had run out of our cycle of time, but also, I think the presentation of the Liberal Party had become a little stale. There's some comparison between what we have now and what was happening then. And I felt that I had to kind of refresh my thoughts, and so I spent a lot of time going to Central America and going to Iraq and going to Africa. And the other part is that I just really felt that these young the MPs, the Sheila Copps and the Don, I mean,
Copps, Boudria, John Nunziata,
Brian Tobin.
Brian Tobin from Newfoundland.
Well, I mean, they were zingers. And I just really thought I wanted to hold back a little bit. And then I think John, who was our leader at the time,
John Turner,
said, Lloyd, I know you want to do international stuff. How about you start going across the country and just talking to Liberals and others about what Canada's foreign policy should be or what our trade policy should be. So I really had a sort of a mission of a kind of grassroots discussion, consultation, and again, I owe that a lot to him because he in many ways, he helped prepare the Liberal Party for the next round, not only in the people, but bringing in people, bringing in ideas, and I think that to me really should be there should be a lesson there for what's happening to the Liberals today.
Well, we're going to get to that. Don't you worry. We're going to get there.
Okay.
But you're right. Yeah, Brian Mulroney wins a second consecutive majority. Then he goes, retires. Kim Campbell comes in. Jean Chrétien leads the Liberals to a big majority in 1993. You're back in power. You're the Human Resources Development Minister. And one day, you get pelted with eggs and boxes of Kraft dinner.
Right.
What was that all about?
The specific issue, and it's one that I felt disturbed by. This was a protest by the Canadian Federation of Students, because I had brought in legislation to change the whole student loan program to what you would call sort of basically an income-based one, so that if you graduated and became a downtown Bay Street investor, you could pay the loan back. If you became a social worker or a care worker, you only had to pay 30% back. In other words, I thought, I think the eggs in the Kraft dinner became because they were at that stage where they just wanted to.
They wanted free tuition.
They wanted free tuition.
They weren't interested in this paying back loans. They wanted free tuition.
Yeah, they wanted free tuition.
Yeah.
And I think they also just liked the idea of having a kick-up and being able to pelt a minister with a Kraft dinner.
They showed up at your house.
Yes.
You had to fight them away with a hockey stick.
Right.
Did you genuinely fear for your safety at a moment like that?
Not that time. There were other times when we had. What I was really mad about was that my son, who was about 11 years old, was coming from hockey practice. Denise was there. We had a small townhouse in Ottawa, and that invasion of our privacy. I simply said, look, you can go after me, you can pelt me with Kraft dinner on the steps of the Parliament, but don't come at my house and start throwing Kraft dinner. That you're taking the step too far. That was the red line.
People of a certain age will remember that in Canada we once used to call it UI, unemployment insurance.
Yeah.
You're the guy who changed it to EI,
yes,
employment insurance. What's the difference?
The difference was that when I inherited that file, it was generally known as the POGI. It was almost a guaranteed income. And that if you worked for 10 weeks, and various provincial governments would hire you for 10 weeks to scrub off the provincial roads, then you got the rest of the year full payment. That was not doing anybody any favors. I mean, sure, it was income support, but people wanted to go back to work. They didn't want to simply sort of be on the POGI, because it was becoming generational. And so what we tried to introduce is things that would help people get reemployed. Training, we started doing shared sort of wage payments. We started working on investing in smaller enterprises, and also beginning to really set up good conversations between labor, business, the educational system, to help people sort of, and at one point, here's an example, Steve. I know it's a small thing, but I can remember being in an airport one day, and somebody came over to me and said, I want to shake your hand. I said, yeah, okay. He said, I'm from Sudbury, and I was one of the people who worked for Inco and was let go. And he said, I worked for the next year and a half sort of planting trees in the outer green belt of Sudbury. And he showed me a picture. He said, look at it now. Okay?
So the greening of Sudbury is one of the great success stories of all time.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Prime Minister Chrétien eventually shuffles you to become the Foreign Affairs Minister. Want to see Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister in action almost 30 years ago? Watch that monitor over there. Sheldon, roll it if you would.
Would allow any force to be able to present a strong, robust rules of engagement against any attempt to intimidate. That would certainly be part of the resolution, and it also means that it provides for good security for the forces there.
That's you at talks in France on the future of Bosnia. You're a part of a decision-making apparatus that decided to bomb Serbia 30 years ago during the Balkans War to protect people in Kosovo.
Right.
A few years ago, at an anniversary get-together, you asked the Kosovars who were in attendance at that event a key question. Did our bombing do any good?
Yeah.
What was the answer you got?
The answer was half of us wouldn't be here if it hadn't happened, which is about as clear an answer. And it's one of those moments when you're in politics, you don't often get to see sort of the consequence of what you've done. And that just struck me is that the ability to intervene, to stop a humanitarian expulsion or execution was something that was going to be a new sort of challenge for the world. And that really led to something called the responsibility to protect, which probably was still, to me, is a hallmark of Canadian diplomacy.
Well, yes, the notion that a government should not have immunity in terrorizing its own citizens. There was a lot of momentum behind the idea back then. Not so much today. What do you think happened?
Well, what happened, of course, was the commission that we had established reported within weeks of the sort of 9/11 disaster, and terrorism became the mantra. Everything had to be about protection, sort of seek out these terrorists, get rid of them. So it sort of changed the dialogue, changed the conversation. However, to the credit, I think, of the Morton government and Alan Rock, who was our UN ambassador, they kept it alive. And so we were actually able in 2005 at the major UN Assembly for summit meeting for leaders, we got the Responsibility to Protect passed as a major protocol for the Security Council. But again, we kind of mussed it up by overselling and over-engaging. Libya was a turning point. Even the Russians and the Chinese went along as long as we were there to stop the killing. And we're going to get rid of the leader, that changed the argument. And they basically, well, we know now, I mean, all of a sudden, Putin and Xi and all these other guys are basically saying the Western law and order thing no longer applies, they're hypocrites, etc. And that was a turning point.
I want to circle back to something you have referenced a couple of times already in our conversation, and that is the notion that in the mid-1980s, the Liberals seemed out of gas and needed some refreshing.
Right.
And here we are in 2024, and you have made the comparison that it may not be dissimilar. In fact, can I put it this way? Towards the end of your book, you have a chapter on Justin Trudeau's broken promises, lack of interest in foreign affairs, indifference, as you call it, to poorer countries. You say he has basically gone AWOL on the world stage. This is very tough stuff.
Yes, it is.
For a current prime minister, Liberal, to hear from a former Liberal cabinet minister. Why'd you put all that in there?
Because I was hoping that as the Prime Minister and his cabinet and the other Liberals in the caucus do some reckoning about where we're at right now, that they realize that there has to be some real change in the way things happen. It's not just the policies, it's how you get there and how you arrive at choices. And I believe, I was asked the other day at an event I was at, how are you going to vote this next time? I said, I'm going to vote for a Liberal, because we want to ensure that whatever happens in the election, win, lose, draw, you want to have good Liberals left to help redefine the party, to start thinking about what liberalism means. And that means that the ministers or individual MPs who really deserve to be returned, or new people should be brought in. This is a chance to revive and start. You talked about the Rat Pack in post-84. Mm-hmm. I think we need a similar kind of transfusion of new ideas and blood, and there's certainly enough young men and women out there who could do it.
Well, what happened to the 2015 Trudeau Liberals who said Canada's back?
Well, we're not. Socially, I think the government, as I say, has done some really good things. Internationally, we no longer are engaged, as we had been since 1945, on the issue of nuclear proliferation. We always said that we can speak up for the countries who aren't nuclear powers, because we were once a nuclear power, and we decided to abrogate that. Yeah. We didn't want to be part of that. So we've always had a kind of legacy we could bring to bear. There's been a major development, a treaty that arrived for the abolition of nuclear weapons. We don't even send people to attend the meetings. We don't have any, I can't think of anybody in our government who speaks out on that fundamental issue.
Well, we've had 5 foreign ministers in the last, 6-7 years.
Right.
How long did you have the job for?
Going on 5 years.
Okay, yeah. So something's changed.
Yeah, well, I think that's partly that revolving door. I do think that the present Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, is going on her 3rd year, and I think she's kind of getting some footing. She's beginning to try to put some new sort of statements and sort of, well, I guess what you would call paradigms into our discussion. But there's not a lot of support. And what is missing, Stephen, is that we spend a lot of time working with Canadians to have them feel that they were involved in making those decisions. Right now, it's all top-down interest, and we're missing a huge amount of energy. And plus, I think, as you know, we may get to this in the question, we're not really leading with our best strengths. We have an opportunity to, in this new world order that we're in, to really challenge on some very major issues like water and climate and things like that, bringing our Indigenous people much more actively into our foreign policy, but we're not doing it.
Well, I'll ask about another, maybe the number one foreign policy issue for the government of Canada today, Donald Trump's going to be president again in January.
Right.
What do you think they should do about that?
I think that they clearly have to be very wary. There are some very deep economic issues. I wish to hell some of these premiers would shut up for a while and stop talking about kicking Mexico out. You need Mexico.
That's Doug Ford's position.
Yeah, Doug Ford's position, and Smith, and he's out there bragging, all the premiers. Look, if you take Mexico off the table, you're left one-on-one with the Americans. You want to negotiate one-on-one with Donald Trump, rather than having the two most important trading countries together? Come on, that's bad politics. And secondly, Mexico is becoming an important customer for Canada. But we've got these guys who kind of, I don't know what they do in their provincial capitals. Do they sort of put tar paper over the windows or something? There's not much light getting in.
Since you are not holding back and giving advice to the current federal government about what steps forward it should take, let's see how far I can push you on this. Should Justin Trudeau lead the Liberals into the next federal election?
That's his choice. And it should be the choice of the Liberal Party, but it's not, because the tools and levers that were once there were sort of scoured out in 2016 when our Constitution was changed from being a party to a movement. And so the ability of constituencies or provincial groups and so on to hold accountability is gone. And so it's been left up to a group of MPs who have no corridor. There's no rules along which they have to play it. And I would think, if I had to give some advice, which I'm going to do because you invited it, I think what the Prime Minister should do is say very clearly, we're returning to a Liberal Party which has a strong constituency-based mandate to choose candidates, not to have them imposed from Ottawa, to make real decisions about some of the key policy issues, and to invite a much stronger set of accountability for those who are holding office.
That would require giving up some control over the process,
yes,
which they don't seem quite enamored with the idea of doing.
No. Well, and I think they'll pay a price for that. But if the Liberal Party, I mean, I think it's true that politics has a certain cycle and your shelf life runs out. But when I come back to a point I made earlier, when your shelf life runs out, you don't throw away all the elements. I think what we really should be as Liberals working towards is how do we use this period to make sure that we have the right people and some good ideas to bring forward in through that election and out, and help rebuild and restate, redefine liberalism that really connects with a large group of people and doesn't leave out almost 60% of Canadians.
If Justin Trudeau were not the leader of the Liberals today, whom would you prefer to see in that position?
I don't have a choice right now. I mean, I think I go back to the lessons a little bit that the American Democrats are learning, that sort of having sort of a chosen sort of dolphin doesn't work. I think you have to open it up and let's see who in the rough and scrum of competing for office. And that means you also have to put some limits on the amount of money you can spend, because our leadership thing, we control finance at the election level, but at the party level, your big donors, can really buy a lot of support.
Okay, a couple of minutes left, and I want to ask you a few a little off the beaten path questions here. Mm-hmm. The Winnipeg Jets are the best team in the National Hockey League. Do you think this is their year for the Stanley Cup?
I sure hope it is, but I want to go back. I think the Jets have always had, the last 2 or 3 years, pretty good seasonal records. When it gets to the finals, they collapse.
Excuse me, we know all about that in this town. Okay?
I know you know about it. I mean, maybe this isn't just a Winnipeg syndrome. It's
no.
Maybe, okay. But I think that Scott Arniel, the new coach, is really smart. I think he's got the backing of the owners. I think they need to bolster a couple of their key areas, but there's certainly a very different vibe coming out of them. And I have to say, I mean, Winnipeggers, I mean, at one point you realize that we were on top of the sports world. We had the Bombers for the Stanley Cup, not the Stanley, the Grey Cup. And we had the Jets, and I think it was 16-1 at that point in time.
16 wins, 1 loss, yes.
Yeah, so things are changing, but sports are important to the Winnipeg town.
Last question. You're about to turn 85 years old in less than a month.
Right.
How do you feel?
I feel pretty good. Not quite as zippy as I did maybe 10, 15 years ago, but you know, I have a good family life. We've moved to Ottawa, and we're with grandchildren and stuff. So I have to pace myself a lot better, but I'm also realizing that doing the book and going back and discovering things, I think my head's working really good these days. And what I really enjoyed about this exercise is going from different towns and different venues, universities or book clubs and stuff, is to have a conversation with Canadians. I really feel, you know, to me that really is a real boost and a jump to hear what people have to say, their anxieties, their wishes, and their. We have the base in this country of a wonderful civic society, and we're just not making the best use of it.
You're still going to vote Liberal next time, though?
Yes, I am.
You are, so you said.
Okay.
The name of the book is My Life in Politics, and we're delighted that it has brought Lloyd Axworthy, former federal cabinet minister, almost a leadership candidate once upon a time, but not quite, to our studio once again. Thank you, Mr. Axworthy. It's been a pleasure.
It's been great to be here.
Great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Monday, November 25th, 2024. Tomorrow on the program, why are permanent residents choosing not to become Canadian citizens? We'll explore that question. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.